Hi, and welcome to my first book review or book review. I'm going to put it in quotation marks because this is not going to be a comprehensive review. Watch the introductory video for my channel. I'll explain what I'm doing there, but just briefly, this is purely someone who's read a book and is talking about it, because I once read a book and the first thing I wanted to do was to hear people talk about that book. So I thought I'd create a YouTube video or a YouTube channel even of videos of me doing that. It'll be mostly classic books, and I'm starting with a classic today. So I'm just going to shoot right into it. The first book I'm going to review is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. There's no real rhyme or reason as to why I chose this book. I was simply in Waterstones and it caught my eye. I want to do classics. I've heard of this book. It's a very famous book. Don't know much about it. I do now because I've read it. I didn't know much about it. I didn't even know much about Oscar Wilde. I just knew it's a famous book. I didn't know it was Oscar Wilde's only novel at the time, but the fact that it was written by Oscar Wilde did intrigue me a little bit. Obviously, I know who Oscar Wilde is. I don't know much about him. There's a few quotes of his that I find interesting. One particularly, I'm a big Guns N' Roses fan, and I once heard Axl Rose give an excuse for his poor punctuality of his gigs as the Oscar Wilde quote of "punctuality is a thief of time." And because it was Axl Rose that said it, and I love Axl Rose, I thought that was cool. So that kind of stuck with me, and that made me kind of want to read it. So I was pleased to then see, as I read the book, that that quote is actually derived from this book. So that was a fun little Easter egg for me. It's quite an easy book to read. I felt there will be spoilers in this video, by the way. So maybe go grab a book, read it. If you're anything like me, return in 6 to 8 months time after you've read it, and then you might enjoy this video more. But yeah, it's quite an easy read. It shouldn't take you 6 to 8 months. It's only about 200 pages long, and if you enjoy it, you'll fly through it. I quite enjoyed it. I wouldn't say I'm like overwhelmed with positive things about it. It was quite enjoyable. There was definitely some bits of the book that I found really cool and valuable, and I'll go into them. Other bits that confused me a little bit, and I'll go into them too. My first takeaway of the book was definitely the first 2 chapters or so seemed like a totally different experience than the rest of the book for me. It was obviously before the plot. It was whilst the plot line develops. I'll quickly surmise the plot line. Well, the basics of it, which is that Dorian is this beautiful, youthful figure that becomes aware of his beauty and how valuable it is, but also how fragile it is due to a process of aging, after a painter paints a portrait of him. And he finds this news devastating, or this realization devastating. And as a result, he sort of wishes or prays to the ether of the world that the painting could suffer the process of aging rather than he. And he gets this wish. And the painting also suffers the process of sin reflecting on his appearance. This is sort of a metaphor used in the book. I don't think it's a complete metaphor. Certainly, if you act in a healthy manner, if you do good things, I think you're likely to be less stressed. If you take care of yourself and make smart choices, you're probably going to reap the physical benefits of that too. So I don't think it's a total metaphor, but it's somewhat of a metaphor used in the book. And that was one of the first things that struck me. So the cover was the first thing that struck me, as any idiot like myself who doesn't usually read books, the first thing we look at is the cover. So this is a picture of Dorian, I assume. Obviously, Oscar Wilde didn't draw it, so I shouldn't take it too seriously, but I did anyway. And I don't know, because this is supposed to be Dorian at the start. I assume this is actually supposed to be the portrait. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's dumb of me, but I think it's supposed to be a portrait. And so I was taken by a few things, because Dorian's supposed to be this spectacularly beautiful person. Now, looking at him, I mean, I would, but I don't know if he's that great looking. But there's also another thing about the cover that I'll come back to in a moment, because the first thing that struck me, I got off track for a moment there. The first 2 chapters, or something like the first 2 chapters, I felt were separated from the rest of the book, just in terms of my experience. And that was because for the first 2 chapters, I was completely like transfixed by the implicit homoeroticism going on. between the three sort of main characters, Dorian, Basil the painter, and Henry, who I don't even know how to describe him, maybe the troublemaker. Yeah, Basil obviously used Dorian as a muse for his painting, and he loved Dorian. And I say loved pretty much literally. He really did seem infatuated by Dorian. It seemed more than a sort of affection for a friend or a muse that is valuable to him. He did seem to have a crush on Dorian, dare I say. And then Dorian also looked up to Henry, more than a male friendship usually sort of involves. And both of those sort of relationships, I felt there was some sort of implicit homosexuality in there. And obviously Oscar Wilde, again, I don't know a whole lot about him, but I do know he has some form of queerness to his sexuality and lifestyle. So I wonder if he was expressing part of that in the book. And obviously at the time, I don't think it would have gone down too well if he was explicit about that, which is probably why all of the relationships are all heterosexual relationships in the book, including Dorian's. Certainly the way that Basil and Henry marveled at Dorian's beauty was unusual. And I've read enough books. I haven't read enough books. I've not read nearly enough books, but I've read some books from sort of an earlier time than today. And in these books, men do seem to be much more sort of open with praising other men's appearance. Quite unusually, actually, they seem more comfortable with that in books then than maybe we are now. I find that quite fascinating. But still, there was something about it that did seem to have sort of an implicit homosexuality to me. I wonder if it was Oscar Wilde expressing his personal feelings in a sort of cheeky, sort of clever way that maybe people at the time wouldn't have noticed, but maybe a gay guy like myself or just people generally who live in this modern society would easily pick up on. Maybe not. Maybe I'm projecting. Who knows? I probably should have, like I say, I could have read the internet to see other people's thoughts on that before talking about this. But again, I just want it to be my own sort of perspective. And that was the first thing in a novel that really grabbed my attention. And it shaped the opening few chapters of a novel for me until the main plot line really progressed. The other thing about the cover, so Dorian becomes corrupted. He starts doing bad things, his soul becomes ugly, and as a result of that, the painting becomes ugly too. And Dorian talks about sort of a turn in the mouth of a painting and a turn in the nose, kind of like mine. I haven't done anything like murdered anyone or broke anyone's heart, at least not intentionally. Broke anyone's heart, that is, not murdered anyone. I think I just played football. I'm not sure what happened, to be honest, but I didn't deserve this. But yeah, I just thought that, like, in the cover, I felt like Dorian's face kind of, I don't know, I feel like the cover, again, he doesn't look that great. His mouth is already a little bit turned for me, and I wonder at what stage this was, but that's really an aside. So the next thing that really struck me about the book was probably my favourite thing about the book. And it was page 98. I'm actually going to turn to it now, and I'm gonna read a little excerpt from the book here, and I apologise for this because my reading out loud can get quite choppy, but it just gives you the context of what I'm talking about. Because this is my favourite page of the book. It's overwhelmingly my takeaway from a book, and also if I read it, obviously not all versions of the book will be printed the same way, so it won't be the same page number for everyone else. Other people can find it. So I'm just going to read a bit of it now. First, I have to contextualise the bit I'm reading. It's after Dorian breaks a girl's heart, Sybil, and he does it in a very cruel way, and as a result, she takes her own life. Dorian's found out this news. At first, he is very upset. Henry, who I said is kind of a corrupter, sort of talks him out of being upset, and it is quite a key point in the book in which it seems like Dorian takes a fork in the road towards a less healthy soul. So let's just give this a read. But I am glad you don't think I am heartless. I am nothing of the kind. I know I am not. And yet I must admit that this thing has happened does not affect me as it should. It seems to me to be simply like a wonderful ending to a wonderful play. It all has the terrible beauty of a Greek tragedy, a tragedy in which I took a great part, but by which I have not been wounded. It's an interesting question, said Lord Henry, who found an exquisite pleasure in playing on the lad's unconscious egotism. An extremely interesting question. I fancy that the true explanation is this. It often happens that the real tragedies of life occur in such an inartistic manner that they hurt us by their crude violence, their absolute incoherence, their absurd want of meaning, their entire lack of style. They affect us just as vulgarity affects us. They give us an impression of sheer brute force, and we revolt against that. Sometimes, however, a tragedy that possesses artistic elements of beauty crosses our lives. If these elements of beauty are real, the whole thing simply appeals to our sense of dramatic effect. I'll stop there. I could go on further. The page does go on further, and it gets more interesting too. But that's really the nuts and bolts of the bit I find fascinating. So Henry sort of helps Dorian through processing this sort of tragic event in a way that he doesn't feel guilty, he doesn't feel upset about it, because of the Greek tragedy element to it. Is so romantic. You know, she loved him so much that him falling out of love with her and dismissing her just meant she couldn't live anymore, and she killed herself for him, and how romantic that is. And this is obviously to sort of view the situation that way and just sort of, you know, water off a duck's back is not a healthy or very sort of good, well-hearted way of processing that. And this is obviously, like I say, a fork in the road where it seems like Dorian truly heads down a dark path. There's other clues that this is a bad thing as well. Lord Henry, who found an exquisite pleasure in playing on the lad's unconscious egotism. So this is obviously a bad thing, the way that Dorian begins to deal with this. However, I'm going to make an argument that it's actually also really great advice for people in certain situations in life. I think that Lord Henry makes a great point that we find some things that cause us grief so hard to process and deal with, because, like I say, the world doesn't make as much sense as we would like to believe that it does, and we also try to make it make more sense than it often does. So when something happens that you just can't possibly make any sense of, and it just disrupts your entire narrative of life, it can kill someone, you know, inside. They can never be the same again, and you don't want that happening, obviously. And that can be a sudden death, or someone taking their life that you love, you know, something like that could definitely cause that. It can be as simple as a breakup, you know, a breakup you just didn't see coming. So I think this is great advice to take with you and remember for when you do suffer a great grief in your life. I don't think there's anything wrong with finding a meaning and a purpose for a bad event, and some way in which it seems to have a positive, so how it seems to be a positive experience in your life overwhelmingly, to help you get past that grieving process and to accept it. For example, if it was a relationship maybe, and your partner just leaves you out of the blue, and you thought you had like the best relationship ever, and then suddenly they just go. Maybe you can you may have to bullshit yourself. It depends how good you are at bullshitting yourself. But maybe you can tell yourself that, you know, they knew they couldn't love you and offer you the same things, and you learned this much together, and because of them leaving you, they left you for you, and they know you deserve better, and you're going to find something better. That sort of process, and we all do it, and I think it's a good technique to sort of help you pass griefful stages. And I can't really give a great example without really having a real life situation to use it in, but I do think that's something worth remembering and worth taking away. I know I took a screenshot on my phone in case I ever need it, and I won't be ashamed of using it. Doesn't mean that you don't feel things, doesn't mean you don't want to not do bad things, but you need to be able to move on from bad things as well. And I think what proves the point is that it applies to good things. You know, in our culture, having an amazing wedding, at least until recently, and it still is quite an important thing. And having the perfect proposal, you know, the guy doing the perfect proposal. And I think that's because in our relationships and stuff in life, it is the romantic element that makes them so meaningful a lot of the times. And that's a legitimate, I think that's legitimate. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's legitimate. In a way, when you enter a relationship with someone, it's kind of like you are engaging on this sort of project together to conjure up the most intimate, emotional, and meaningful relationship you can. And doing things like a perfect wedding and perfect proposal, maybe they had a lot of pressure on it, but they do help towards that. And it's, I think, like The Perfect Proposal, it's kind of, you see it in nature. It's like when a bird builds a nest to impress a potential mate. I think, A Perfect Proposal, it's showing the person you're proposing to, I understand the sentimentality of a relationship. I understand all of this sort of meaning of a relationship, and look what I can produce, and I can use my emotional intelligence to sort of manifest this moment that heightens that and really brings it out and makes it real for you. So I think it is sort of an act like that, and I think it's good. I know that I've done it in relationships. I know I've had relationships that the reason why they've been so intense and emotional and intimate is because me and that person were really great at that. I actually remember one relationship, we sort of had a song. This song was meaningful to us. It was a very meaningful song for us. A sad song, but it was a positive one in that relationship. And we went through a rocky time and things weren't looking good. And then we sort of had one night where it was a little bit better. I seemed to sort of reconcile the situation just a little bit, and we were led in bed. And I thought that I could push the situation over the edge back to a good place by playing the song at the perfect moment. But it wasn't the perfect moment. It was too soon. Things hadn't been dealt with yet. So I played the song, and he instantly shut it down, shouted at me, "Don't play that song." And he was right to do so, because it was clumsy on my part. It wasn't artistic. It was forced, it was rushed, and it was my sort of job, and I think it is someone's job to get those moments right in a relationship, to really sort of manifest the most beautiful relationship possible. But yeah, that's a huge tangent, but that's all that I took away from that page. Is why I loved that page. It really sort of had a big meaning to me. But yeah, that was the overwhelming, that's my overwhelming positive thing about this book. I just really took a lot from that page. Overall, the book, it kind of felt, I don't know, there was a time in the book where it sort of went from Dorian being young to sort of like in his late 30s, and I found that hard to deal with. I know I went from picturing Dorian as the boy on the front of a group to picturing, because I knew he was supposed to look young still. You get told all of a sudden, it's like a new chapter, you get told Dorian's like 39 or something, but he's supposed to still look like 18. And I found I knew he was 39, I couldn't get that past my head. And I also knew the sinful things he'd done at this point, so I knew, how ugly he was. And so in my head, for some reason, I started picturing him as Jim Parsons, the guy who plays Sheldon Cooper in The Big Bang Theory, as most will know him as. But I didn't picture him as Sheldon Cooper, because that would be weird. You can't imagine Sheldon Cooper in old England. Doesn't make much sense. And stabbing someone, that's the emotion I was doing there. Because Dorian stabbed someone. Spoiler alert. But no, it was Jim Parsons playing a role in Hollywood, a Netflix series where he plays a sort of slimy, gay, perverted agent. And again, I already kind of decided Dorian was gay. So, and he becomes older and he becomes slimy. So it just fitted, and it made it tough for me to sort of get really emotionally involved in the rest of the book. So I'm imagining Jim Parsons, and Jim Parsons just isn't a figure that I associate with sort of serious thoughts. So that was interesting. I did think the jolt through time was a little sort of rushed. I felt the whole book was rushed. It felt like a long fable to me rather than a novel. I didn't really feel like it got fleshed out. Maybe that's because it was Oscar Wilde. You have to call him Oscar Wilde. You can't just call him Oscar, can you? That's because it was Oscar Wilde's only novel. Maybe not. I'm not really a person to judge that. But it did feel more like a long fable to me. It didn't feel fleshed out. And yeah, I found that tough. I tell you what, it kind of felt like, if you ever watched Ricky Gervais do stand-up, Ricky Gervais is a comedy genius. He's a very intelligent man. He's seen stand-up comedy, so he's very good at it. It's very funny. I like it. But I watch it and I feel like I'm watching someone do an impression of stand-up comedy, not actually stand-up comedy. It just doesn't feel natural and right. And that's kind of how I felt about this book too, in a very respectful way. Now, granted, with Ricky Gervais, he does stand up with a PowerPoint behind him, and he has a Madonna headset. It doesn't make you think stand-up comedy. That doesn't help Ricky. I think he might have ditched that now. It's not a bad idea if you haven't yet. It kind of makes you feel more like you're a 16-year-old being lectured on the dangers of drugs and STDs at a local theatre, less so stand-up comedy. But nevertheless, he's a genius and is still funny despite not really feeling like stand-up comedy. So yeah, that's kind of how I felt about the novel as a whole. The ending made sense to me. It was the only really logical ending. I won't quite give that away, I'll have to spoil everything about the book. But it was the most logical ending to me. And because the book felt, like I say, like sort of like a long fable, and I think I saw it described as like a moral fantasy, I wanted to take some great meaning away from the book, and I couldn't, aside from that one page that I loved. I'm not sure what the moral of the book was, if there was one. I get, it's don't be totally, involved in vanity, for sure, because, things go awry for Dorian, by the way. But that's kind of obvious. Maybe it wasn't at the time. We all sort of know that now. Maybe that wasn't so obvious at the time. That doesn't quite satisfy me as a takeaway from the book. I think I wanted to see more about how Henry's life played out rather than Dorian's. I thought Henry is a more interesting character. A lot of the moral theses, is that a word? I don't know, sort of articulated in the book came from Henry. He sort of philosophized about his sort of, I'm not sure what his, I guess it was a hedonist sort of philosophy. He sort of believed in just pleasure. So I wanted to see how that played out in his life. You did get a little snippet of that at the end. I know his wife divorced him. He kind of seemed like a less content character towards the end, somewhat more resigned. He talked about, fearing death. So that certainly does suggest a lack of fulfillment and maybe not someone who's nailed life. So yeah, I guess you did get like an implicit thing there of Henry's attitude towards life was not well advised either. But I would have liked to, I feel like I as a reader could have benefited. Maybe I'm dumb and not everyone else needs things to be this literal, but I feel like I could have benefited from maybe Henry's character talking me through, maybe just having some sort of revelation or something and talking me through what the moral of a book beyond the don't be completely obsessed with how you look, and be more concerned with the beauty of your soul rather than your face, point of a book, because that wasn't, I didn't find that to be quite enough for me personally. But yeah, it was an alright book. It was about 2 or 3 weeks ago that I finished it now, so I haven't thought about it a whole lot since. I don't think I would recommend it to someone, but I wouldn't put someone off reading it. I feel like I should sort of consume more of Oscar Wilde generally and how he generally operated, just to sort of give him that sort of fair respect, I guess, and really understand a guy and his work. And I might do that if I have time. Overall, I'm not going to give a sort of a rating or anything. I just want to give my thoughts on the book. Please hit me up with comments, messages, like, share, whatever. I would love to hear more about anyone else's thoughts on the book, anyone else's thoughts on my thoughts, corrections. There'll be plenty of those, I'm sure. Anything like that, please. Any book recommendations too. I'm definitely taking book recommendations. The next video I think will be Hemingway, The Sun Also Rises. So expect that soon. I'm currently reading that and I'm really enjoying it. So I'm enjoying that much more than I'm enjoying this, to be honest. I enjoyed this. So I'd imagine that will be my next video, unless I just decide to do one on a book that I previously read in the meantime, if this takes me a little longer to finish than I anticipate. But I hope you enjoyed the video. Like, share, comment, do as you wish. Thank you for watching, and I'll speak to you all soon.